The shirt I'm wearing tonight, you can see this here, it says "Thou shalt not kill," was given to me by a group called the Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. This is a grassroots organization made up of individual groups and individuals that work together to end the death penalty. The new executive director of that group is Maria DeLiberato. I cannot pronounce her name, I'm sorry. I've said it 1,000 times to myself when I cannot pronounce it. Maria is originally from Pennsylvania, where at age 8, she was inspired to become a trial attorney. Maria acquired her grit and discipline by playing basketball in high school and running cross country in college, which is not easy. She left the cold of Pennsylvania for the warmth of the Miami-Dade prosecutor's office right after law school, where she learned about crime from the perspective of victims and their families. 3 years later, she worked for defendants doing post-conviction appeals, where she was reminded that people are better than the worst thing they've ever done. Litigating from both sides of the courtroom, she says that she learned that an attorney cannot properly work as a defense counsel until they've seen the pain and loss suffered by victims' families. One of the capital defendants that Maria represented on appeal was Clemente Aguirre. Maria will tell you the story of a Clemente who was wrongly convicted of killing 2 women and who spent 14 years in prison before the conviction was reversed and the charges were finally dropped. She'll also tell us about plans for legislation that we can write to our representatives about and ask them to have the courage to push for an end to the death penalty or capital punishment in Florida. Maria says she's excited and proud to lead FDP Florida, the Floridians for Alternatives, and are hopeful that we will see the death penalty abolished in Florida. So now I give you Maria.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. There are no judges that I appear before that can ever say my name, so I'm never offended. Maria is fine. As Suzanne said, I'm the current Executive Director for Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. FADP is what we go by. It's a mouthful otherwise. I'm also a capital defense lawyer. I'm an assistant public defender part-time in the Sixth Circuit, and I've been doing capital defense work for the last 16 years. And I am going to talk about Clemente, and I am going to talk about all the reasons we should abolish the death penalty, which do include the risk of executing innocent folks. But before I do that, I want to tell a story about someone who was just read on that list, who was a client of mine, Larry Mann. He was executed in 2013, and he was guilty, no question about it. He committed a monstrous act in 1980, but he was not a monster. And I have this Bible with me. It's his Bible, and the way that it came to me is very moving to me and part of the reason that I do this work. And someday when we abolish the death penalty in Florida and I'm standing there when the governor is signing that, this will be with me. So Larry was our client. I started this work in 2006 in September, and I had been a prosecutor. And I loved being a prosecutor. I loved being in court, and I felt like I was really doing justice, right? I was really trying to right the wrongs and do what I thought was right. And I did that. And there was also a lot of injustice that I saw as a state attorney. And so an opportunity came to be to do this death penalty work. And it was all post-conviction. So everybody had already been convicted and sentenced to death. And I started on a Monday, and my then supervisor, who later became my law partner and is a dear friend of mine, had recently had a new lawyer start who was a prosecutor who quit after like 2 weeks because she hated it. And she was like, I'm not doing this again. And she was kind of mean to me at the beginning. And we're friends now and we laugh about it, but she was not very friendly. So she's like, I'm going to just make you go to death row on Friday. She's like, we'll just, see if you're actually cut out for this. And I'd been to jail as a prosecutor, but I'd never been to prison. And I don't know what to expect on death row, right? I don't know. I saw like Silence of the Lambs. I was like, is that what it's going to be like? I really had no idea. And so we're driving there, and it's, of course, in Stark, and I live in Tampa, and the office was in Tampa. And so we're in the car, and we have about 13 clients that we're going to see that day. And in the car, the other lawyers are sort of telling me kind of giving me a summary of the crimes and the people and a little bit of the circumstances. And, I'm kind of overwhelmed. I mean, it's day 5 on my job. I don't know any of these people. And we get there and we go to death row and we visit 13 clients back to back. And back then our budget was pretty tight and they wouldn't allow us to stay overnight. So we'd have to leave at like 5 in the morning, get to death row by 9, you visit people all day and then drive home. And it was a brutal, long day. And, you're sitting with men who are on death row, right? And I mean, I'm 26, I think at the time, 27. And we meet all these people and, they all have stories to tell. And I met Larry Mann and I couldn't, I wasn't connecting any kind of crime or anything like that, right? I'm just talking to these people and he was just really calm. He was almost like a monk is how I would describe him, I think. He'd been there since 1980 was the crime, so this was 2006. He'd been there for 26 years. He was very, almost like Zen-like. He just was complete. He wanted to know about me, he wanted to know where I came from, what my kind of hopes and dreams were. I learned that he was an artist. He would later paint 2 pictures of my dogs, both of whom have passed on, and these paintings are on my wall, and I'll show you all pictures after if we have a few minutes to chat. They're amazing. When my house is ever on fire, those paintings are coming with me. And we kind of go through the whole day, and we're driving back, and Mari, my boss at the time, was like, what did you think? And I think she was expecting me to just, I don't know, run or something. And I was like, it was really sad. The whole day felt very sad. And she was like, who did you kind of connect with the most? And I was like, well, Larry. I was like, he's remarkable. Like, he's so hopeful and positive. And what did he do again? And she told me the crime, and it was a brutal crime of a child in 1980. And I was like, wow. You couldn't even see he's not the same person. And over the years, we represented him from then on. He was executed in 2013. And I remember the day his warrant was signed, and it's such a weird experience. I've had the guys on the road describe it to me, and I know many of you do prison ministry, and I know that you've had these conversations with them too, but whenever a warrant is signed, the guards in the white shirts come down the hall, and they read the warrant, and they take them off of death row and over to Florida State Prison to put them on death watch. And so the door opens, but the door opens and closes 100 times a day, right? So they never know. These men that are waiting for this potential warrant to come, it could come at any point. They don't know. Because Florida, unlike other states, it's completely up to the governor, right? Once you're through the appellate process, you're eligible. The governor decides when clemency is over. So typically at this point, this was during Rick Scott's era, there was an execution every month. It was 2013, 2014. It was a brutal time to be a capital defense lawyer and more so to be a death row inmate in Florida. It was a beautiful Friday afternoon in 2013, and I had been at a conference actually for Clemente's case. Clemente's evidentiary hearing on his innocence claim, we had gotten his DNA results, was later, 2 months later set. I'm driving back to the office, and I looked down at my phone, and it's a call from my boss, and it's Friday afternoon, and I was like, this is not good. And the governor signed a warrant on Larry Mann. And so what happens then is 6 weeks. You've got 6 weeks, 5-ish, 6 weeks to just do everything you can to try to stop this execution. And you kind of know that it's probably not going to be stopped, but you have to try. And everybody who had done it before, this was our first warrant, everyone that had done it before was like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's a sprinting marathon, what is really happens. It's a good thing I was a long-distance marathon runner myself, so the endurance is not that much different, candidly. But we get a phone call to Larry right away, and as he did throughout the entire process, handled it way better than we did. He was like, listen, I'm ready. It's my time. I'd like to live, but if it's my time, it's my time. I know where I'm going. And he was such a man of faith in his conviction and how he lived his life that it was truly inspirational to witness and be a part of the last 6 weeks of his life. We were able to connect him with his daughter. His wife was pregnant when he went to prison, so he'd never met her. He'd never met her outside prison walls. We were able to reconnect him. He had a loving family who supported him. We spoke to his brother regularly. because of how he was and who he was in prison, the guards treated him very well. When he was on death watch, it was around Easter time, and there was like a big sort of Easter, the Department of Corrections is very strange. They had like a big Easter party, and they brought Larry some of the food left over, right? I mean, you can't make this stuff up, but they brought him the food, they brought him ice cream, and they, prayed with him. Brother Dale, who's here tonight, was his spiritual advisor, and I know walked us through that process, was present with my law partner, Mari, at the execution. And, we fought as hard as we could, stayed awake hours and hours. I think I wrote hundreds of pieces of paper and pleadings, and we made all of these arguments, and they all failed. And you all sort of knew that it was not going to work, but you did it anyway, for the sake of the fight, and for the other guys on the row, and for Larry, and for everybody to know that they have someone fighting for them. And I can't tell you enough what it means that there are gatherings like this, and that there are groups like what the Tallahassee Citizens Against the Death Penalty, like FADP, they hold vigils. Like, that matters. It matters to our clients to know that there are people outside that are praying for this to stop, that are in support and solidarity. Because in that room, there's not a lot. One attorney witness is allowed, one spiritual advisor, and the rest are not people who are on their side. And so Larry was executed, and we get kind of the last call and all of that, and it happens, and it's tough, right? It was April 10th of 2013, and every year on April 10th, I think about Larry, and I think about what we all went through and what the community went through. And so, he knew where he was going. He was at peace. He had written us a letter a couple of days before, and he mailed it. And the letter was like, it was like, we got it after he was executed. And he was like, if I'm still alive, like, great. But, it was sort of very funny, of course, until the very end. But he was just thanking us for believing in him and fighting for him, and grateful for all of the support. And I kept that on my wall for a very, very long time. And so a couple of years later, I had another client by the name of Donald Dufour, which is interesting because Donald was connected to St. Edigio. He had a group of pen pals. There was a second grade class in Rome who wrote to him. He had a pen pal who was very active in St. Edigio, who wrote with him back and forth, shared paintings and pictures of the kids, and they were like so excited to have their Florida death row pen pal. And he was also a very sweet, very funny client who got sick. He had cancer, and medical treatment on death row, as you may imagine, is pretty bad. And he kind of went, he was doing well for a while and then not. He had a really strong intellectual disability claim. He would have potentially gotten relief later on after Hall, but he passed away. And we were able to go see him, before he died. We saw him in the hospital, and he was like, he had an estranged family. He's like, I want you guys to take my property. He's like, there's some books in there. He's like, I want you to send some things to the children in Italy. He had like all these things that he wanted us to do. He knew he was dying. And he was like, and there's something in there that I know you will want, and you'll know it when you see it. And I was like, okay. So he passed, and we got his property, and we kind of put it in our conference room, and it was like 6 boxes, and we kind of put off going through it, if I'm being honest. Sort of sad, right? Like, this is the last sort of things of, someone's life, and it's just kind of reduced to a couple of boxes. Like, there were shoes in there and a TV and things. And so we're going through the books, and I pull out this Bible, and I open it up, and there's a bunch of notes in it, and there's a note on the front page, and I recognize the handwriting right away, and I know it's Larry Mann's handwriting. And it's before his execution, and he wrote a letter to Donald, who he was friends with, and they all sort of knew that we represented each other, and Larry was a friend to everyone on the row. He called him Brother Don. And the last line I want to read to you, and it says, "So, my brother, never forget, never doubt that I know the goodness at your core." And he signed it like a bee, and Donald used to sign all his letters like a tree. It's just what he did back and forth. And the Bible is ascribed to Larry Mann. It was gifted to him. And so before Larry was executed, he gave this Bible to Donald, wrote this note, and Donald left it in his property and wanted me to have it. And I do, and I have it, and I carry it with me whenever I'm doing something important. Every oral argument I've done before the Florida Supreme Court, every trial I've done, Clemente's evidentiary hearing for 2 weeks, this was in my bag. It will be there when we end the death penalty in Florida, and I know Larry will be watching. And his story just inspired me so much to do this work. And it's hard, and there are colleagues of mine in the room, public defenders, who do this work, and it's hard. And yet, having a community of support, coming here and watching people who go to death row, who visit our clients, who are with us in this fight means the world to us and to our clients. And so I do want to talk about what we can do, right? Having these celebrations, I was speaking to someone earlier. We started our day, board member Herman Lindsay, FADP board member Herman Lindsay is in Rome today. He was at the Coliseum for the lighting. They light the Coliseum on Cities for Life, and he sent videos. It's on our social media. If you don't follow us, you definitely should. It's amazing. And so, I mean, we're really like celebrating this worldwide. And we can't do it without your help. And so I'll get to that sort of at the end, what will it take to end the death penalty in Florida? It'll take education. We have a lot of work to do to educate our lawmakers about why we don't need it, why it doesn't keep us safe. We need action. We need people on the ground. We need people writing letters. We need people talking to their legislators. They need to know that their constituents don't want this. And we need money. It takes money to hire. There are 2 full-time staff at FADP, myself and our communications coordinator. Everybody else is volunteer, and they're amazing. And if we can grow our organization, and that is my goal as the leader of this organization, and we want to hire a campaign coordinator, we want to hire an organizer so that we can actually get to every corner of Florida and talk to I want to talk to every single legislator. That is my goal over the next couple of years, to speak to every single legislator and tell them the truth about the death penalty, which is it delivers nothing but harm, and that we don't need it to be safe. And I'll have lots of things that I can have you guys do and in your communities, and then I want to leave some room at the end for some questions, because I definitely want to answer some. But I do want to talk to you, as Suzanne said, about Clemente, because one of, I think, the most compelling reasons, and I as a defense attorney, right, I'm like, I fight for the guilty just as much as I fight for the innocent, right? That is who I am at my core. But I have to be realistic, and especially when we look at Florida, we have more exonerations from our death row than any other state in the country. And when you're talking to somebody who might be on the fence about the death penalty, what they'll say is, well, what we have to make sure we get it right. The person has to be 100% guilty. First of all, you can never know that. But when we look at Florida's system, it is so deeply broken. 30 people have been exonerated from Florida's death row. There's 300 on death row, between 300 and 400. The statistics say that's about 1 in 4 are wrongfully convicted, and there's more out there. And they're fighting DNA testing. The state is fighting against DNA testing. I could tell you hundreds of stories of other folks that are facing execution in this state that are very likely innocent. But Clemente is one that I know for sure. I represented Clemente when I was at CCRC, which was our state agency that assigns lawyers to death row inmates in their post-conviction appeals. And I got his case in 2009, and I went to Florida State Prison to meet him. He is 4'11". He's the tiniest person. I'm not a tall person, but I felt like a giant. And he came in, and he and I present a lot. I was hoping to get him to come up here, but he was unable to. He lives in Tampa. If you haven't had a chance to hear him speak, there's definitely videos of him speaking, and he and I will definitely come back to Tallahassee together and speak. He's just remarkable. But he was pretty angry by the time I met him. He'd been on death row for a couple of years. He had some of the worst lawyers I have ever seen represent him at trial. They did nothing. They didn't believe him. He'd always said he was innocent. He found he was next door neighbors to the 2 women who were murdered. He went there the morning that they were discovered. He was drinking with his friends. He was 20-something years old. He wanted to get more beer. He sees that they're dead. He doesn't call the police because he's in our country illegally. He was from Honduras. He fled Honduras because of gang violence, and he came to the States in 2002, and he was arrested wrongfully in 2003. So he was only here for a little over a year before that happened. So he comes upon these two women. He doesn't call the police. He tries to resuscitate one of the women, so he gets their blood on him. He sees a knife that he thinks someone else is in the house. He picks up the knife. He's like, is anyone here? He's not thinking straight. He's been up all night. He's been drinking. He goes home. The police come, eventually discover the body. Someone else who ends up being the actual murderer in the case, her boyfriend shows up, finds the bodies, calls the police. Police come. First, nobody speaks English. He doesn't really tell them. He's doesn't know what to do. And then he's like, I need to tell them that I went in there, right? He's like, I have to tell the truth. And so he goes and he tells the police that he went in there and that he found them and he didn't call the police. And they were like, great, case closed. They did nothing else. They're like, you were here, that's it. They arrested him, charged him with 2 counts of murder. Terrible lawyers, did no investigation. It was a death penalty case, of course. And in Florida back then, the law was not unanimous, so you didn't have to have a unanimous jury verdict for death. So he was 7-5 and 9-3. So he was convicted and sentenced to death on 2 non-unanimous jury verdicts. And in the middle of the penalty phase of his trial, the sentencing phase, he got so upset. He's like, you're saying, you're trying to kill me for something I didn't do. He kind of had this outburst, and they had to take him out of the courtroom. And, later on when all the DNA comes out, one of the psychologists who witnessed that was like, I think it was the interpreter. The interpreter was like, he was right. I was like, yeah, this guy is so upset because you're trying to sentence him to death for something he didn't do. So I meet him in 2009, and he's just like, you're not going to help me. And I was like, okay, you don't know me at all. You don't have to trust me. You don't have to trust me at all. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to keep doing my job, and we'll keep working on it. And we kept working on it. And it didn't take long until he understood that I was really trying to hear what he had to say. And we started to investigate, and it was pretty clear early on that he didn't do this. For me, the first moment where I knew that was we went in, so he was at a bar the night before, and he was there till about 3 a.m., which would have alibied him depending on the time of death. And his lawyers never went to the bar. They never talked to anybody. They never found out what he was doing. And so we go to the bar, and it's a Saturday morning. It's 2010, so this is seven years after the murders, 7 or 8 years. And we kind of walk, we don't tell people, as a defense attorney, as a capital defense attorney investigator, you oftentimes just show up, right? I'm not gonna tell somebody I'm coming because they may slam the door in my face. So we just walk into the bar, and we sit down, and they're like, can we get you anything? And we're like, we're looking for Bob Buntruck. He's the owner. And the bartender's like, well, he'll be here later. Who are you? And I was like, I'm Maria. I represent Clemente Aguirre. And it was that moment where the room stopped. It was like a record scratch or something. She froze. She almost dropped the glass in her hand. And she said, oh my God, I can't believe someone is actually helping him. I know he didn't do this. And this is, 8 years later, she has no idea we're coming. And at that, I had chills in my body. I still, every time I tell that story, because then I was like, something is very, very wrong. And so we started to investigate. We learned that the daughter of the victims, it was a mother and a grandmother that were killed. We learned that their daughter had a lot of mental illness, had been Baker-acted 60 times, had violent outbursts with her mother, had threatened to kill her mother repeatedly. One of the victims was stabbed 129 times, which, is typically not something that you do unless you have an intimate relationship with the person. So we were able to get DNA testing. The prosecution didn't object to the first round of DNA testing, which was actually amazing. We wanted to test all the blood in the house. It was a stabbing, so there was lots and lots of blood. And we wanted to test it, and the prosecutor said to me, he's like, I know why you're not going to find anything, but I know why you want to test it. And I was like, great. So we tested probably the first half of the bloodstains. And 4 blood drops came back belonging to the daughter of the victim. So there was 4, and they were in an area where the state at trial had argued that Clemente cleaned up. There was a trailer where the murder happened, and there was a bathroom, a back bathroom. So 4 drops of her blood were like, and she was on my list of suspects, but candidly, there was a few other people on the list. This was not the best neighborhood in Seminole County. But I was like, okay, this makes sense. Then we come to find out that there's a police report that they hid from 2012 where she was Baker acted, this woman, her name is Samantha, and she said, demons in my head made me kill my family. They sat on the report. They never turned it over, even though in the report it said, like, there was someone arrested for this murder. Never turned it over. They finally turned it over to us. So now we have her blood and a confession, and we continue to, and now we go to the prosecution. We had the Innocence Project on board, and we're like, do the right thing here. Like, you've got the wrong guy. And they're like, no, absolutely not. He's guilty. She's mentally ill. Okay. So we ask for more DNA testing, and now they object. They won't do any more DNA testing. Thankfully, the judge granted limited DNA testing of a few more items, so we find 4 more blood drops. So there's now 8 blood drops of her in the house, none of Clemente, nothing belonging to Clemente whatsoever, and nobody else. So it's victim blood, and it's her blood, and it's drips all in the same area where the victim blood is located. And so the state then tries to say, well, that blood is old, she used to hit. I mean, the somersaults that they did to try to keep this man in prison, it's infuriating. So the DNA comes back, it's 2012. The confessions are 2012. We go to hearing finally in 2013. Incidentally, Larry Mann was executed on April 10th, and this hearing started on May 13th. I think I remember someone saying, I think I lost like 12 pounds or some ridiculous amount between that. I weighed like, it was not a great, 2013 was a very, very terrible year. But we had a 2-week evidentiary hearing for Clemente where we presented all of this evidence. And I thought for sure, like, the judge, she wasn't the best, but I thought for sure she would, like, how could you possibly say he's not entitled to a new trial? We have blood, we have confessions. We'd found other witnesses that came forward. There was a dash cam video where she was like, it's my fault, they died because of me. And the cop who was arresting her started giving her Miranda rights because he's like, I thought she was confessing to murder. Like, that's what he thought. We present all this evidence. The judge takes it under advisement. That August, she issues like this 100-page order denying relief. And, Clemente had maintained, obviously, once the DNA came back, and he said to me when the DNA came back, he's like, as long as my mom knows I'm innocent, I can wait as long as, as long as I want, So he's like, we called his mom as soon as the DNA came back, and, of course she knew he was innocent already. I didn't have to tell her that, but he wanted her to know that the DNA proved it. And so, it's this series of like, this great elation, right? We've got DNA, we've got confessions. How possibly could we lose? And we lost. And as a lawyer doing this work, I was a mess, right? But then I have to talk to my client, and I can't be a mess. I have to be strong, and I have to stand up, and I have to say it's okay, and we'll fight this and fix this. And we did. And we built a team, and we were like, I'm like, nobody's going to listen to me up there saying he's innocent. So we built this team. We got these lawyers from Alabama, from a very conservative law firm. One of the judges is now on the 11th Circuit, appointed by former President Trump. So it was a very conservative Alabama law firm. These folks had never been to a prison before. They came, I picked them up at the airport. They were wearing suits. It was very adorable. And they were great. And they were very clear with Clemente. They're like, we are not opposed to the death penalty, but we don't think the death penalty should be applied to, they were very concerned about innocence, right? But they were not opposed to the death penalty, and they made no qualms about that. And Clemente, respected that, and so did I, candidly. We knew, who they were, and they worked tirelessly on this case with us, and they did the appeal with us. And just having their name attached to it gave us the credibility that we needed. And I wish it wasn't like that, right? I wish that wasn't true, but it is, and it worked. And at the oral argument, there was this whole testimony about a knife and whether the knife came from a restaurant that Clemente worked at, but it was a very common kitchen knife. And one of the justices, Justice Quince, at oral argument was like, I have that knife in my kitchen. I was like, okay, this is going well, right? So the argument was, I think, in April of 16, and later, it was October of 2016. So opinions for the Florida Supreme Court come out on Thursdays at 11. Like, that's when they come out. And so every Thursday at 11, you're just like hitting refresh on your computer and just, and so it comes out and we're all just screaming. And my boss at the time thought there was like a car accident because everyone was just screaming so loud. And so we got to, of course, call Clemente. The prison doesn't allow phone calls like that same day. You have to do it the next day. So I knew he was going to see it on the news. So like every like news outlet that we talked to, I was like, congratulations, Clemente. Like, and he did. He heard it all. The guys on the row were all, banging on the cells. They're like, gotta turn on the news, you won. And so we're like, great, okay, he gets a new trial. Clearly, surely, it's a unanimous decision from the Florida Supreme Court saying that not only basically saying he gets a new trial, but also saying that Samantha is a scapegoat for his crime. Like, that's the language in the opinion. Surely the prosecution is not going to continue to try this case. I should know better. They did. They said, we're still seeking the death penalty. We're still trying this case. So I was at CCRC then, and we couldn't do retrials. We couldn't do the trials. So now it's like, we got to build a trial team. My former boss, Mari, who had left CCRC, she was able to get appointed to represent him. The Alabama folks were on board. Innocence Project was on board. They built a huge team, and I just consulted for the next 2 years. I consulted and I talked to Clemente every week, and it was in 2018, finally, we had picked a jury. We were probably halfway through jury selection, and the alibi witness of the girlfriend finally, basically, they had listened to, hundreds of his jail calls, and he had told his wife that Samantha went out the window that night. So he was basically no longer alibying her. Now, he came into court and he was like, well, I was lying. I lied to my wife. I lie all the time, but I'm not lying about this. I'm a liar, but not that much of a liar. I mean, it was just absurd, and it became very clear what they were going to do. But they couldn't go forward. So but they wouldn't tell us. So they leave on a Thursday, and they're like, listen, we need a couple of more days. Come back on Monday, we'll have a decision. So we don't really know. We don't know if we're going forward. We don't know what's happening. Well, what's happening is they finally realized they should put an ICE hold on him because he was here illegally, and this was, of course, 2018. So Clemente, because he's so smart, they put an ICE hold on him, and they tell him he has a legal visit, and they bring him some paper that's a voluntary deportation. He's like, I'm not signing that. That's not my lawyer. I'm not signing anything. I was like, good job. So they come into court on Monday, and we still don't know what they're going to do, and I'm sitting in court, and they just stand up and say, the state of Florida announces a null pros, which is a dismissal. I collapsed into the chair that I was in, and we, just sort of couldn't believe it, and the judge, gave us all a chance to speak, but of course he has this ICE hold, so he can't leave with us. But Clemente wants to speak, so he stands up, and he quotes a scripture verse, which I will screw up, but he always says it right, and it's that he didn't want to have to walk on rocks, so the Lord gave him angels, and he was talking about the angels being his lawyers, and he was, of course, looking at Mari. I'm just bawling my eyes out, looking at us, looking at his lawyers. But what he said was, and he looks over at the prosecution, and he was like, I don't have hate in my heart. And I was like, I do. And I was like, for me, I learned more from him in that moment, because it doesn't help to be angry about it, right? It's okay that I'm angry about the injustice, but there's no reason to hold on to the hate. And he was right. He was right then, and he's right now. But he said it, this is moments after, and they stole 14 years from him. He spent 10 years on death row, and at the beginning, he didn't even speak English. He taught himself English on death row. And so he, was really at a disadvantage. And so they dropped the charges, but then he's not with us, right? And so it's this bizarre thing, and I talked to him as he's being led away, and I was like, call me when you get to the immigration. We had a plan. I tried to get a bond and all these things, but we thought it was going to be days or weeks, and there was a chance. This, again, was, there was a chance that he was not going to get a bond and that he was going to have to just be deported because otherwise he would have to stay in detention for a long time. So he looks at me and he said, Maria, wherever I'm going as an innocent man. I don't care. I'm like, okay, again, you're teaching me way more than you're helping me way more than I've ever helped you, but okay, good, go where you're going. So we go out, we're like at lunch, and it's very bittersweet, because we're all like, he's not with us. And we get a phone call from his immigration lawyer, and they're like, if you can get here by 3 p.m. with some money to bond, it was like some crazy thing, and all of us just like, somebody I think paid the bill at the restaurant. I have no idea. We all just started screaming, run out of the restaurant, basically drive to the immigration site, and he walks out, and he comes out, we were able to get a suit on him, and he comes out, and he's in my car. And it's just me, Clemente, me, and Mari, who was kind of our first original team, right? We represented him together in 2009. And I kept saying, like, I can't believe you're in my car. I mean, it was just the most remarkable thing. And those next few days, watching him sort of acclimate to his freedom, and it's been 4 years. It was November 5th of 2018 was his freedom date. And he lives in Tampa. He comes to my house for Christmas Eve every year. We do Feast of the Seven Fishes at my house, and he's always there without fail every year. And, people say like, oh, that's the system works. No. They stole 14 years of his life, and he's still struggling. His immigration case, his first court date is in 2024. He has not even had a first appearance. He's not allowed to work. He doesn't have a driver's license. He's still struggling to make ends meet. He's reliant on donations from the Innocence Project and things like that, and speaking, and he's a phenomenal speaker. And so for me, I love to tell his story to people who are on the fence about the death penalty, because it is a compelling story, right? That's a reason to abolish the death penalty. There's a bunch of other reasons, and that is a reason to do so. But I also want to make sure that when we're talking about this, that we also talk about the morality of it and why it's wrong and why it doesn't help and why it creates more harm. And so as we move forward in the legislative session, one of our priorities is passing legislation to protect the seriously mentally ill from the death penalty. So Florida does not have a ban on the execution of the seriously mentally ill. Many of the names that were read tonight, Pedro Medina, Thomas Provenzano, Arthur Good, a lot of them were incredibly seriously mentally ill and did not have any rational awareness of either why they were being executed or even the nature of their crime at the time. And so we want to advance and pass this legislation to protect the seriously mentally ill. The bill was introduced last year. It made it through committee and then never really got a full vote. Both of our sponsors have left the House and the Senate, so we're still searching for a new sponsor. And that's one of our goals. And so I have our petition out there. If you haven't already signed our petition, I'm going to ask you to do so before you leave. You can do it online, or you can sign the actual petition. If you are not already on our mailing list, I'm going to ask you to be on our mailing list. You'll get our updates, our emails, all of our action items. We will have letter writing campaigns. We will have postcard writing campaigns to your specific senators. The other thing that's going to be of critical importance in this legislative session is we do think there probably will be a fight returning to try to return Florida to non-unanimity. So Florida, of course, was the only state, one of the only states, 3 states to have non-unanimous verdicts, and then the U.S. Supreme Court told them you can't do that. And they fought about it for a little while. They had 10-2, and then they eventually went to unanimous. But as many of you may know, the Parkland verdict, last 2 months ago, I guess now, was 9-3 for life. Well, 3 votes for life, and so it was life. And almost immediately, the response was, "We got to change the law. We got to go back." And our hope is that that was just reaction in an incredibly emotional, terribly tragic case. I mean, I cannot and I will not stand up here and pretend to imagine the pain of losing a loved one. I am always inspired by Deacon Grosmaire and his wife and their commitment to speaking out and talking about forgiveness and moving past past is probably the wrong word, but moving through their grief in that way. And what I do know is that even though the victims in Parkland probably don't feel this way, because they were told that justice is the death penalty. And that's just not true. It's not. That doesn't have to be true. But that's why they're so angry, because they feel like they didn't get justice. But what I do know is that for the next decade, they will not be dragged back into court. They will not have to face this case over and over again. And in a death penalty, that's how it has to be. Because you have to give somebody a lawyer for the rest of their life until they're executed. Well, that's what the law says. If they have a life sentence, you don't have to. Nick Cruz will go off to prison. He will have one sort of uneventful appeal, and that's it. They won't be dragged back into court, and they can start to move forward, whatever that might look like for them, and focus on healing on that community. And the reality of that situation is what happened with Nick Cruz. His lawyers offered to plead guilty to 34 consecutive life sentences 4.5 years ago. They spent at least $6 million, at least, prosecuting him. That is just the sheriff's office budget. The numbers are all rolling in, so we'll have all the accurate numbers, but sheriff's office spent well over $2 million housing him. State attorney's office, prosecution costs, public defender costs, the media, all of that, to have a trial where the outcome was exactly what they offered 4.5 years ago. And it's just a waste. And I can think of a bunch of different ways that we can spend money and protect people in the state of Florida, and think about how we can stop people like Nick Cruz from getting to the place where he got, right? What we know is he was born addicted to drugs and alcohol. He was in the foster care system. The system failed him. And so maybe we can spend some of the resources trying to stop that from happening, instead of spending our resources trying to execute someone after a tragedy happens. And so what we will do in the legislative session is we will push SMI, and we will fight against unanimity, against a return to non-unanimity. And what we're doing and what we're saying and what the messaging I want you all to say when you're talking to your friends and family members and colleagues and lawmakers is that, look, I don't want Florida to have a death penalty. I don't think we should have one. I think it should be abolished. If we're going to have one, it should be accurate and reliable, and it's not. It's not by a long shot. So passing this SMI legislation, keeping unanimity the law, those are baby steps. I would much rather see a repeal bill, and we will. I believe it. And we're not quite there yet, and that's okay. And so my ask of you is talk to your friends, talk to your family, sign up, sign our petition, donate when you can, ask people you know who can donate. We've got lots of volunteer opportunities at FADP. We have people that we would love to write, opinion pieces. If you know somebody whose family member was murdered and they are willing to speak, we want to hear from them. So that's my ask of you, is to participate. I love events like this. I believe in the power of prayer. I was there when Larry was ready to go, and he knew where he was going. And there's power in that. And there's power in action. And I want us to take action together so that we can end Florida's death penalty. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have.